On behalf of the Wellesley Debates Committee and President Bottomley, I would like to thank everyone for coming to the third Wellesley Debates. My name is Rubina Verbeek, and I'm the Student Director for the Wellesley Debates and will also be serving as your moderator today. I know it is a busy time of the year, and hopefully our contentious and provocative topic and our engaging speakers will invigorate you to power through the last weeks of this semester. Our student-generated debate resolution today, Profiling Practices Strengthen National Security, has been chosen because of its centrality to American and global discourse. The idea of provocative debates and contentious issues are well known at the Oxford Union debates, the model for our Wellesley debates. This is illustrated in Oxford Union resolutions such as, "This House would ban all zoos," "This House would detain its asylum seekers," "This House would allow sex selection for in vitro fertilization." Needless to say, the Oxford Union debates facilitate discussion on tough questions. It is our aim through these debates to provoke intense discussion in a face-to-face forum. Free speech is uniquely important to this college because it is a community committed to reason and rational discourse. Free interchange of ideas is vital for our primary function of discovering and disseminating ideas through research, teaching, and learning. Ironically, in an open society, we who have the possibility and right to express ourselves freely often do not. People are often too afraid to express their views on contentious issues because they worry about the sensitivity of others, or they do not want their positions scrutinized. Because no other community defines itself so much in terms of knowledge, few others place such a high priority on freedom of speech. The Wellesley Debates allows individuals in our community to comfortably exercise the right to express and listen to unpopular views. In a vibrant intellectual community as our own, we need face-to-face confrontational dialogue on important issues to encourage discussion and allow diverse opinions to be heard. Now for some practical matters. Again, the motion for this spring debate is Profiling Practices Strengthen National Security. Hopefully you have all voted on a pre-debate ballot when you came in on which you voted for or against the motion. If you have not done this, please do so now. At the end of the debate or when you need to leave, the lovely Carrie Scanlon, who you all met on your way in, will be asking you to do the same on a post-debate ballot. Also, please make sure that you vote only once. In addition, I would like to thank President Bottomley for sponsoring the debates, as well as the other members of the committee, including Faculty Advisor Professor Cushman for his guidance and instruction, and Carrie Scanlon, who has helped out considerably. I would now like to introduce our panelists. Arguing for the motion that profiling practices strengthen national security is Jillian Cunningham, class of 2010, who is majoring in neuroscience, Mecca Ali, class of 2010, who is a Peace and Justice Studies major. Arguing then against the motion that profiling practices strengthen national security is Galen Danskin, class of 2011, an English major, and Veronica Martinez, class of 2013, a political science major. Our debate structure today will take place in 3 parts. First, each speaker will have exactly 8 minutes with which to make their opening statements. We will alternate speakers in the following order. Jillian will begin, then Veronica, then Mecca, and then Galen. At the 7-minute mark, I will give each panelist a 1-minute verbal warning, something like 1 minute, and I will verbally notify them again when their time has expired. Should they go over time, I will alert them via this special gavel that President Bottomley has provided, and I do not think anyone wants to talk over this. All right. During the rebuttal section, the 2 teams will each have 6 minutes to rebut the sides of the opposition's presentation. They may do so by addressing any points that they wish. Finally, each side will have 6 minutes for closing statements. Now, after the debate, we will open the floor to you, the audience, for a question-answer period of 25 minutes. Before we start that part of the debates, I will briefly review some guidelines and etiquette. I want to emphasize once again that this is not just a lecture. The goal of each panelist is to move your opinion, and she will do this by making arguments for or against a very provocative motion. So please make sure you have voted and do vote afterwards. The results of this debate will be uploaded onto the Wellesley Debates website. And I would like to ask that if your cell phones are on, please make sure to turn them off at this time. Thank you again all for coming. And just one last time, the motion is Profiling Practices Strengthen National Security. And Jillian, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to this debate. I would first like to acknowledge Professor Cushman, Robina, and Carrie for their hard work organizing this event. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Do profiling practices strengthen national security? Yes, they do, because profiling practices mirror logical and successful human responses to a threat. Before I flesh out this argument, however, I wish to immediately address a fundamental misconception about what profiling means with regards to safety and security of an individual or of a nation. Specifically, profiling does not equal racial profiling. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of offender profiling is, quote, a system analyzing and recording the probable psychological and behavioral characteristics of the perpetrators, so they can be matched with the known habits and personalities of suspects. Nowhere in this general definition of profiling does race appear, and yet discussions of general profiling practices often become mired in rhetoric related to political correctness due to the immediate but erroneous association of profiling with racial discrimination. Indeed, law enforcement engages in many types of profiling, most of which are never challenged by a nation's citizenry, and in fact are sometimes lauded in unexpected ways. For example, how many of you have ever watched the television program Lie to Me on Fox? Is not the entire premise of that show based upon a criminal profiler trained to read criminals like books? In the context of national security, would you argue that such forensic psychology profiling is neither effective nor warranted? I wish to also challenge the critics of profiling practices with the notion that we all profile on a daily basis in a less sophisticated but fundamentally similar method as does law enforcement. Let's say that you are a young woman walking down an alleyway alone at night in a dangerous part of the city, which you shouldn't be, but I digress. You see a person coming towards you. Your senses heighten, the adrenaline starts pumping, and as the person steps into the street light, the light of the street lamp, what is your reaction? Relief or terror? I would posit that your state of mind at that moment depends upon the physical characteristics of the person in front of you. If you see a 90-year-old lady carrying a bag of groceries, you breathe a sigh of relief and continue on your way. If, however, you see a younger man, his disheveled clothes not hiding the fact that he is much larger than you are, your natural flight response will kick in to get you away from the perceived threat. What have you just done? You used physical characteristics to profile your alley mate and assess your risk of harm. Previous experience, whether direct or indirect, as well as logic, tell you that the man is more of a threat than the grandma because it is more likely that he will attack you. Who is to say that this tactic of threat assessment that we all employ to ensure our personal safety is inappropriate to apply at a macro scale to ensure the safety of a nation? I also find it puzzling that the term profiling has become so politicized, particularly in the post-9/11 world. Considering the previously outlined example, what would you call this type of profiling? Stereotyping? Generalizing? Being careful and cognizant of your surroundings? Where do you draw the line to differentiate good profiling from bad profiling? In this vein, I'm going to make what some of you may take to be an extremely controversial claim. Affirmative action is racial profiling, generalizing particular needs and traits to specific ethnic groups. If proponents of affirmative action acknowledged that it was a form of racial profiling, they would say it was for a good cause, furthering the education of those who have faced adversity. It seems that such an argument implies that profiling for the sake of good is acceptable, whereas profiling for bad reasons is not. Okay, on that premise, isn't it good to keep a nation safe? To keep the people of a nation free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness? With these claims in mind, I will now walk straight into the lion's den to address profiling in the United States with regards to national security in the face of terrorism. I probably do not have to remind you all that a notable Wellesley alum, Hillary Rodham Clinton, class of '69, is our Secretary of State. Well, according to the State Department website, quote, terrorist networks currently pose the greatest national security threat to the United States. The greatest threat and the most wanted terrorists come from the Al-Qaeda network, end quote. So to protect national security, we need to fight against Al-Qaeda. As we are all aware, the leaders of Al-Qaeda are Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Since these two men do not themselves directly carry out terror attacks, the country would obviously be much better off, speaking in terms of national security, if those who engage in acts of terrorism on their orders are stopped. So, who are those working for bin Laden and al-Zawahiri? In a statement signed by both men and put forth in the pan-Arab daily newspaper Al-Quds Al-Arabi, quote, we issue the following fatwa to all Muslims. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. And continuing, and we, with God's help, call on every Muslim who believes in God to comply with God's orders to kill the Americans. So in light of this statement, who wishes to threaten U.S. national security? All Muslims? Of course not. Al-Qaeda terrorists are part of a politicized radical fringe that most certainly does not represent those who practice Islam. But let's look at the logical progression of this argument. According to the State Department, Al-Qaeda poses the greatest threat to U.S. national security. The leaders of Al-Qaeda have issued a statement saying, essentially, that every Muslim who believes in God, which is all Muslims, by the very definition of the word Muslim, which means one who submits to God, they should follow God's orders to kill Americans. How is law enforcement to know who is listening to bin Laden's orders and who isn't? The point is that is extremely difficult. So law enforcement cannot rely upon one surefire identifier that would mark these extremists. However, it would be reckless not to employ every resource at your disposal to help identify those who wish to threaten a nation's security. Looking only to profiling would be literally a grave error on the part of law enforcement, because most of those who fit the profile of an Al-Qaeda terrorist are definitely not terrorists, and there are certainly outliers. However, it seems too large a risk to gamble with the lives of a nation's citizenry by not matching the scrutiny to the specific threat. Intelligence-based profiling practices as a component of traditional investigative law enforcement can therefore enhance a nation's ability to protect its citizens. Thank you.
Time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Jillian for some really great comments. My name is Veronica Martinez, as Rabina said, and today you'll hear from Galen and me about why profiling is actually detrimental to national security. Galen and I will break this up for you in two main points. I'll mainly discuss the logistical inefficiencies, while Galen will describe the constitutional consequences and the effect profiling has on our national identity. We'll tie our two concepts together by offering some alternatives to profiling and explaining how these alternatives' costs are minimal compared to the costs that profiling brings about. Now, I'd like to begin by telling you two stories. The first is the story of Peggy Robertson. Now, in 2007, Peggy Robertson applied for health insurance. Unfortunately, Peggy suffered from a pre-existing condition: her sex. You see, until recently, insurance companies functioned under the unsubstantiated claim that women use their health care more than men, charging women between 4 and 48% more than men. Now, they charged these exorbitant rates even when the plans didn't include maternity care, and even charged women who didn't smoke more than men who habitually smoked. When Peggy applied, the company refused to cover her because she had undergone a medically mandated C-section. The company insists that Peggy become sterilized before they covered her. Now, thanks to the recent health care bill, being a woman being a woman is no longer a liability. In fact, our country has moved one step closer to embracing the fact that one's biological sex is not a liability. The second story I want to tell you is the story of Raid Jarrar. In 2006, Raid Girar attempted to board his flight home to California. Unfortunately, Raid suffered from a pre-existing condition: his ethnicity. You see, Raid wore a shirt with the words, "We will not be silent," printed across the front of his shirt in Arabic and English. Now, TSA officials informed Raid that it is impermissible to wear an Arabic shirt to an airport, and equated it to a person wearing a t-shirt at a bank stating, "I am a robber." In 2009, Raid settled with the airline in court about their discrimination. Raid's refusal to remain silent brings us one step closer to eradicating ethnicity as a liability. Now, while individual cases like Raid and Peggy's certainly offer compelling emotional and moral dilemmas, there are a couple of other aspects I want you to pay attention to this afternoon. Galen and I are going to show you how profiling is based on arbitrary stereotypes and assumptions about race and ethnicity. We'll demonstrate that profiling is actually less efficient than other methods. And lastly, if you still think profiling has marginal benefits, we'll explain that these benefits are negatively outweighed by their costs. Now, before we delve into the specifics, we need to set out exactly what Galen and I are arguing against. Profiling, as defined by Amnesty International, is the targeting of individuals and groups by law enforcement officials, even partially, on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion, except where there is trustworthy information relevant to the locality and time frame that links persons belonging to one of the aforementioned groups to an identified criminal, incident, or scheme. Essentially, profiling occurs when law enforcement officials consider specific people suspects based on their presupposed stereotypes rather than corroborated fact. Now, currently, the status quo is essentially an absence of law. The 14th Amendment clearly calls for states to offer the same protection of law for all citizens. Yet the very definition of profiling is unequal protection. Now, beyond our own Constitution, the United States has signed several international treaties forbidding profiling, namely the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which all explicitly prohibit their discrimination. In addition, in 2004, Congress passed the End Racial Profiling Act. It prohibited profiling and granted any affected individuals to bring about civil action, thus legitimizing possible lawsuits. Now, the trouble with the End Racial Profiling Act is that there are serious barriers in place to prevent resolutions from coming to fruition. The plaintiff must show either intentional discrimination or an adverse effect driven by some form of discriminatory animus. This means that they would have to show that law enforcement officers practice profiling with malevolent intentions, speculation that is difficult to prove in court, but easy to be a victim of. Now, because profiling is a slippery concept, we should consider the statistics, what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. For example, a 2000 General Accounting Office report found that black U.S. female citizens were 9 times more likely than white female U.S. citizens to be x-rayed after being frisked. Yet, black women were also less than half as likely as white women to be found carrying contraband. From a statistics standpoint, profiling is especially deleterious because of the small difference in probability between people who fit the profile and those who don't. If we assume one group is more likely to perpetrate these attacks, a dangerous assumption in itself, but I'll speak more about that in a minute, the percentage of people within the group who would actually commit these offenses is small. Therefore, if we assume, say, 4 out of every 100,000 people of a certain ethnic group were to attack our nation, compared to 1 out of every 100,000 of another group, the percentage difference would still be in the thousands, something not statistically significant. Thus, we're wasting resources by profiling. Now, I just mentioned that assuming one group is more prone to attacks than another is a dangerous claim. As former Homeland Secretary of State Michael Chertoff explains, by pigeonholing one ethnicity as terror-prone, we're dangerously excluding other possible suspects. He elaborates, saying, if you look at the airline plot of 2006, 2 of the plotters were a married couple that were going to get on a plane with a baby. The terrorists understand that the more they vary the kind of operative they use, the more likely they're going to be able to exploit prejudices if we allow these prejudices to guide the way we conduct our investigations. So what can we possibly do to prevent terrorism? Well, there are a number of viable alternatives to choose from, actually. First, officials should narrow the pool of their suspects from any one specific ethnicity. They can do so by more effectively flagging high-risk flyers by cross-checking visa databases with flagged flyer databases and flight records. Also, more extensive X-raying could evenly distribute the security burden throughout the entire flying community. Lastly, our best weapon against security issues and racial discrimination is education. By educating officials about the waste of resources that is profiling, they'll be more prepared to protect our nation against a variety of threats.
1 minute.
Keep in mind the stories I mentioned a few minutes ago. Peggy's pre-existing condition, her sex, was nullified by spreading the insurance burden. We could do the same for people like Raid, nullify his pre-existing condition, by broadening our security techniques and refusing to remain silent. Now, as Jillian mentioned in her opening statement, Al-Qaeda posed a risk too large to gamble with our citizenry. Profiling is a risk too large to risk gambling our citizenry. We are one community, and we should respect each other and offer each other equal protection under the law. Thank you.
Profiling practices strengthen national security because they provide a proactive way of dealing with crime and conflict. From a conflict analysis perspective, it is important to identify the groups that are high risk for being engaged in conflict with one another and with the larger society as a whole. According to John Burton's basic human needs theory, conflict is inevitable, and it escalates wherever there are groups of people that feel alienated as though they exist outside the mainstream society. Now, this theory is applicable to larger social issues and deep-seated problems such as institutional and structural racism that are the real issues that we need to deal with. To understand these underlying issues is to understand why certain groups are more inclined to engage in criminal activity. With this in mind, profiling as a practice of conflict prevention and management brings attention to various social, historical, and psychological conditions that may make more groups feel frustrated. This frustration often manifests itself in rebellious activities that can range from a high school student skipping school to an international terrorist network using commercial jets as their weapons of choice. Identifying these at-risk groups is a common and successful peacekeeping method that is used both in the U.S. and abroad to deal with crime and to deal with the greater social issues that led to the crime in the first place. Security officials are responsible for using this information to keep us safe and to maintain order in the short term, and this information about the profiled group can then be used by the government, NGOs, and policymakers to address the underlying issues in the long term so we can address those problems in the future. It is important to understand profiling as a legitimate means of proactively utilizing information collected by studies and statistics that expose problems between groups in any given society. I keep using the word proactive because it is crucial to have a proactive system in place when dealing with issues of crime and national security. What good are crime statistics if they aren't used to lower crime and better our society? Will crime rates ever decrease if we aren't willing to directly address the unfortunate realities of this imperfect world in which we live? If you were to take a moment and imagine a world where our law enforcement officials only chase blindly after those who committed acts of crime without regard to what they know and what has already been proven, I'm sure you can imagine that such a world would not be very efficient or safe to live in, for that matter. Profiling practices are fact-driven, objective policies that, in conjunction with other law enforcement techniques, work to keep us safe. Unfortunately, the only time you hear about profiling in the media is when it is used excessively, alongside police brutality, and when it is positioned as an extension of institutional racism. These media portrayals are incredibly problematic because they are not commentaries on the success and usefulness of profiling itself, but instead they attach negative meanings to profiling that actually belong elsewhere. To confuse using facts and logic with police brutality does nothing to address the real issues of personal prejudice and abuse of power. Instead, police brutality is blamed on profiling, when in fact, a racist cop will more often than not act upon his own instincts, regardless of what he has been told to do. This person in power who is motivated by racism will then use profiling as an excuse for behavior that is harsh, unnecessary, and inexcusable. To confuse utilizing a proactive method of dealing with crime and institutional racism is, in my opinion, a very serious misunderstanding of what institutional racism truly is. Now, disproportionately convicting people of color for petty crimes is not a product of profiling. That is a little something I like to call racism. Arresting every black person in a predominantly white neighborhood is yet again not a product of profiling in itself. That is the excessive use of force and a disturbing abuse of power. Profiling is to be made aware of certain behavioral, psychological, and sometimes physical traits that can be connected to certain types of criminal activity. An extra security checkpoint in the airport is a very small price to pay to prevent a potentially horrific event that could occur. A police officer performing routine stops as a part of an investigation of criminal activity in an area is a small price to pay to catch criminals and keep neighborhoods safe. Every day there are examples of law enforcement officials doing their jobs respectively and unobtrusively. Many people in this room have probably been stopped by a police officer while driving. Some of you have received smiles. You may have been asked basic questions and then you were sent on your way. Others of you may have had to deal with rude behavior, excessive questioning, and perhaps were even fined for something minimal like a broken taillight. The first scenario, while inconvenient when on your way to an important appointment, is not really a story generally worth sharing and is often considered too innocent of an encounter to be considered truly profiling. The second scenario would immediately be labeled as an instance of profiling, and a real issue of a rude, disrespectful, and perhaps prejudiced cop would be ignored. Profiling practices are positive and efficient ways of dealing with crime and conflict, but their objective purposes have been corrupted by a new definition of profiling that highlights elements of racism and police brutality that do not belong to the concept of profiling itself. In today's day and age, we have been made terribly aware that there are people in this country and elsewhere in the world that threaten our very livelihood, and it is vital for us to utilize the proven methods of dealing with crime, conflict, and terror. Burton's theory brings our attention to why certain groups are more likely to engage in conflict. Their lack of belongingness can be attributed to dissatisfaction with the system in which they live, but cannot be contributed to profiling in itself. Domestically, a better understanding of the way certain people generally function in the United States could serve us well to better our society. In the international sphere, understanding how America is perceived abroad and how certain groups are taught to negatively perceive our nation could potentially save lives. Profiling practices do strengthen national security and can further strengthen national security if understood correctly and implemented properly, efficiently, and objectively. Thank you.
Great. So this section, first I'd like to thank everyone else for coming here. This is a great room, and I'd also thank our great moderator. Thank you so much. And also my partner. So through this section, I'd like to engage in a small thought experiment. I'd like to theoretically concede to my opponents that this argument, that profiling policies, that they may actually be efficient in catching terrorists, shoplifters, and people who insist on driving while black. So first, though, I want to look at their argument a little, and I'd like to sort of redefine what profiling is and what profiling has been in their argument. So although Jillian attempts to establish that profiling is something logical and something that's not lodged within race, we said that her first real example in the government is something that is lodged within race, in someone's ethnicity, in fact, their religion. And so we see that the moment that she applies this sort of theory of logic to her argument, we see that it immediately becomes racialized. And I think that's something really important. You have to keep that in thought as the argument keeps on going on. Furthermore, I would like to, her example about the streetlight is a really interesting one because there is one old woman who I would not want to be caught under a dark alley with, and that is my grandma, because she would beat you up, okay? So, I'm just bringing that up to say that, like, sometimes you can't profile people basically on what they look at, because my grandma would cut you, okay? And you should be scared of that. And you should not put your guard down, okay? So this goes against my partner Veronica's point, that like we do have to apply the same amount of caution to everyone that we engage with. And just saying that because someone is a young male doesn't automatically make him dangerous. I mean, we are a women's college, but come on, right? So, as Veronica addressed earlier, there is no reasonable advantage to profiling policies. In fact, through funneling our resources towards these inefficient, superficial judgments of guilt, we actually harm our collective ability to respond to national security threats. However, in this speech, I would like to examine why we cannot use simple efficacy to determine the outcome of this constitutional debate. Although the topic of this debate says that profiling policies strengthen national security, I sincerely doubt that Wellesley College students will vote for our opposition if they advocated for a strict police state. While a Big Brother system may increase national security in the strict sense of numerical infractions, this definition is severely limited and, I would argue, faulty for our unique form of debating. National security isn't just about who has more guns. It should include the security of our Constitution, the well-being of our nation, and the legal safety of the various people who live and travel within our borders. Following this definition of national security, in my following speech, I aim to explain why this type of policy would irrevocably damage our Constitution, our citizenry, and our national ideals. So why is this policy constitutionally unsound? Well, if we turn to the Fourth Amendment, we can see that we have the right to be safe from unreasonable search or seizure without probable cause. And in case any of you haven't studied up on constitutional law recently, my race, my ethnicity, my gender, my sexuality is not probable cause for anyone searching me because of this handy thing called the 14th Amendment, which says that all citizens should be treated equally under the law. This is paraphrasing, but I'm sure you get the gist. So therefore, it's unconstitutional for a representative of the government to make decisions based on race, or gender, or sexuality, or anything like that. But though this is nice and fine, we have to be realistic, and we have to realize that sometimes our Constitution has to bend, and there are reasonable limits on the protections that our Constitution offers us. In certain cases, our constitutional rights can be violated for the greater stability and safety of our country. In the case of profiling, the only way that profiling has and could be legal would be that if it passed a judicial process called strict scrutiny. Now, strict scrutiny compels the prosecutor to prove that there's a compelling government interest, that this policy is narrowly tailored to achieve that goal or interest, and that the policy must be by the least restrictive means for attaining this interest. Great. However, you can see that any time we have violated this policy for a religious, for an ethnic, or for a racial reason, it's been really harmful, and in retrospect, maybe 20 years later, we look back and we're pretty ashamed of ourselves. One of the most notable cases of this is in Korematsu versus the United States, where the Supreme Court allowed the U.S. government to order Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II. But since I doubt that any of us in the room right now would call that the internment of Japanese Americans just, or right, or even the least restrictive means for achieving an interest, we are led to a more complex conclusion. On this side of the table, I would like to argue that any of these methods, efficiency or legality, of breaching our constitutional rights are profoundly unsound and should not be implemented because of the populations motivated to implement these policies, the citizens affected by these policies, and our national ideals. So now let's turn to look at the populations motivated to implement these policies and why we would implement profiling policies in the first place. And what I want to say on this side of this house is that populations motivated to implement these policies are primarily driven by irrational or hyperbolic fears. Why did we want to forcibly contain large populations of Asian Americans during World War II? Well, we were in a time of war, and we thought they would go to the other side. So now, why do we want to restrict the movements of Arab Americans through excessive airport screening and customs discrimination? Well, we're in a time of war. Doesn't that make sense? No. A time of war does not and should not justify absurd policies that abuse the rampant fears of white middle-class Americans. We are provoked by an irrational fear of the other, and we should not give in to this. This is enhanced by provocative language, by talk show spin hosts, I'm not going to name any names, but certain people that create a climate of fear that makes us feel as though we cannot interact with the other without them physically or psychologically harming us. So what I want to say for us is that currently we're dealing with this war on terror. And I want to ask when will this war on terror end? What is terror? How are we fighting this war? What I want to say is that we currently in our political system have this climate of fear, and that's very dangerous. And if we give into that at the moment, we start to engage in a slippery slope where one thing will lead to another thing, and pretty soon our fear can justify anything. So we need to stop it where it is. So in addition to indulging in a damaging fear of the other, this type of policy would increase the stigmatization of racial and religious minorities. Race struggles in this country are not over. Just because Obama won the election doesn't mean that discrimination permeates every aspect of our lives. The United States has a terrible track record of discrimination, and we shouldn't look to add to this. Pulling over black drivers, searching Muslims, stereotyping ethnicities, and doubting rape victims. This only shows how willing we are to assuage the white man's fear of the other. But what we have to recognize is that we are the other. We are the fears that we look for in others. We can no longer believe that race, sex, etc. can demarcate any group's propensity to engage in a specific type of behavior. Even if I was found with copious amounts of illegal drugs, terrorists, and manufactured Senate bus passes in my dorm room that does not and should not reflect upon Irish immigrants, Wellesley women, feminists, queers, or English majors, all of which I am, but none of which should solely represent me. Yes, African Americans can purchase cars legally. Yes, terrorists do come from America, and yes, the best shoplifter in my high school was a white rich girl who was very good at math. And the last thing I want to say in this argument, and this is a little ambiguous, and I hope I can fit this in 30 seconds, is that, through implementing these profiling policies, we're fundamentally damaging the idea of what it is to be American. And I'm not talking about something that, appears in the Constitution. I'm talking about something like change. I'm talking about something like I have a dream. That, I'm talking about something that's like equality, something that we feel fundamentally within us is something that calls us American. And when we say that I am different from this other, whoever this other is, that my skin color makes me better, or what religion I am makes me better than you, and they will look at you more because you are Muslim, I say that's wrong.
Time.
And I say that no one here can hold to that. Yeah.
This concludes the argument portion of the debate. We will now begin the rebuttals. Jillian, you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I think the first point I would like to address would be the idea that profiling is a waste of resources, which implies that it doesn't work. And I would like to provide the example of El Al Airlines and the Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. That airport is probably one of the airports, and that airline is one of the airlines that is the most desirable terror target. The authorities at that airport, they engage unabashedly in profiling, and again, I'm not saying racial profiling, I'm just saying general profiling, because they look at everything. They ask everyone questions, they look through every bag, and then they additionally, through computer screening processes, they identify those who need to be doubly screened. But through these practices, they have not had a successful hijacking since the 1970s. So I think that their success actually speaks for the fact that it is an effective policy. Additionally, the idea that because we can't catch everyone, we shouldn't catch anyone using these policies is not entirely rational. So if we don't catch everyone, that's unfortunate, but does that really mean that we shouldn't try and get the few that we can? Additionally, I would like to look at the arguments about the Constitution. The first point I will make is that civil liberties are basically for the purpose of maintaining life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, you can't have liberty and you can't pursue happiness if you don't have life. So that's a problem. Also, the issue of the Fourth Amendment, talking about probable cause. When Mecca and I were discussing what profiling means, and when we started reading the literature, it emphasized the fact that profiling is a component of general law enforcement, and profiling, again, does not necessarily equal racial profiling. There are other markers that law enforcement, that will send up red flags for law enforcement. And therefore, under the Fourth Amendment, there would be probable cause. For instance, in the case of some of the 9/11 hijackers, there were plans of U.S. airports. There were extensive email exchanges that the FBI had they had suspicions in the summer of 2001, but nothing was done. So, given that that evidence, there is probable cause. So the Fourth Amendment doesn't actually apply. Let's see. So another point that I would like to address is again this idea of racial profiling, discrimination. Those words have been thrown around a lot here. And I think Mecca really made the point in her opening statement that when there are cases of discrimination, that is not a result of the profiling policy itself. That is a result of deeper issues that are in fact not caused by the profiling. So the idea that it's necessarily discrimination, well, when statistics show that certain groups have propensities to engage in certain acts, that's not discrimination. That's simply using objective facts to promote national security. So, I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to divide this up. I'm going to go with the first half, talking about more of why it's inefficient, and I'm going to disabuse you of some of the facts that Jillian just said, and then the next half will be Galen explaining more of the constitutional problems with profiling. Now I'm going to talk about her affirmative action example first, then the fact that we all profile, then I'm going to talk about her proactively using statistics, and then a couple of other of her points during rebuttal. Now, this affirmative action example, that this is proactive racial profiling, that it's for the good, it's good profiling, that's not true. No. Affirmative action is based on statistical facts. That there's a record that these ethnic groups have been held back in the past historically, and that affirmative action is meant to equalize this playing fields again. It's not based on the fact that, oh, I'm Puerto Rican, so I automatically have to go to Wellesley to fill a quota. No, it's based on the historical fact that, Puerto Ricans have been held behind in the past because of our race. Now, the next fact that we all profile. I'm going to have to disagree with this too. Now, if we all profiled a Wellesley woman, what would we see? Well, I think most of you would agree that you can't actually profile a Wellesley woman, because then you'd be missing the broader spectrum of diversity that we are. I'm Puerto Rican, Galen's apparently Irish-Scottish. I don't know what Rabina is, but I'm guessing she's different than me. And if we just profiled a single Wellesley woman, we'd be missing these intricate details. Now, I'm also going to talk about how Jillian said we must proactively use statistics. Now, I agree with Jillian. We should proactively use statistics. So now let's look at those statistics. U.S. Department of Justice report on police found that that African Americans were 20% more likely than whites to be stopped, and 50% more likely to experience more than one stop. But on average, search and seizures of African American drivers yielded only 8% of evidence at the time, and searches and seizures of white drivers yielded evidence 17% of the time. Now, as I mentioned before, black female U.S. citizens were searched 9 times more than white females, but black women were half as likely to be found with contraband on them. And lastly, approximately 70% of drug users are white, 15% are black, and 8% are Latino. But the Department of Justice reports that among those imprisoned on drug charges, 26% are white, 45% are black, and 21% are Latino. Now, those are the numbers. Those are the statistics that racial profiling is based on. Now, I'd next like to go on to the point brought out in opening, that it's important to identify high-risk societies. Now, in 2003, a white college student, boarded Southwest Airlines with knives 7 times. No one caught him because he was a white college student. He was part of a high-risk society, but he was white, so this was not considered a high-risk society. Next, Jillian mentioned that if you don't have life, you can't pursue happiness. This is more of the fear-mongering that proliferates racial profiling. We can't just stomp on our civil liberties. They're there for a reason. Some more x-rays, that's okay. You go to the airport, you expect to have more x-rays. More searches, that's fine. But we can't just target certain groups. It has to be spread out equally. Now, I will agree with Jillian on one point, that profiling is caused by deeper issues. She's right. Profiling is caused by deeper issues. That does not mean that we should just disregard profiling and remain silent. Galen?
Yeah, so on that topic, I'd like to address a few of the comments that they have made. So first, I'd like to address what is profiling. And my opponents said that 9/11 could have been prevented by legitimate profiling. However, all the evidence she brought up does not fall under the definition of profiling. If you accept that the definition of profiling is the targeting of individuals and groups by law enforcement officers, even partially on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion, except where there's trustworthy information. And in her case, she only cited trustworthy information, so that case would not be profiling. And if you listen to many of their arguments, they're actually not talking about profiling in many of their arguments. It's a little strange. For example, the Israeli airport argument, she doesn't actually mention profiling in any bit of the argument. The argument looks at everyone, which actually falls under our insurance analogy, and how we said we should spread the burden to everyone, and how we should look at everyone equally. Furthermore, she also says that they use a computer program to look at people, and that doesn't really say anything. We don't even know if profiling is being implemented in that. So these two examples of where profiling was effective in her case really don't make any sense and don't fall to her side of the floor. Okay? And I guess finally I just look to look at this idea of you need life to have liberty and happiness. And again, to enhance my partner's argument, that is another type of fear-mongering, okay? There is a reason we don't live in a police state. There is a reason we have life and liberties. If you wanted to value your life over everything else, then we would probably live in iron boxes all day and stare at first class. I mean, that would be a great way to live. Not gonna lie, you'd probably live for a very long time. But that doesn't mean you would be happy or fulfilled, or if I doubt you would be pursuing your happiness on first class, but I don't want to discriminate. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is that we have our Constitution for a reason, and we should uphold that. And I charge them to give us a better idea of why we should breach our Constitution for this argument. And so far, they really haven't given us any of this. They need to show us why it's acceptable to break our Constitution, to discriminate against people, and to implement these sort of policies. And they need to show us that we have actual solvency on their side of the House. Because so far, I really don't see how any of their profiling examples are legitimate profiling and are actually efficient. Thank you.
Okay, this concludes the rebuttals portion of the debate. We will now go on to the concluding statements. Veronica, you have the floor.
Okay. I'd like to go back to this fact that profiling is caused by deeper issues. Well, yes, it is. It's caused by racism and assumed stereotypes that one race is more likely to terrorize another race. One race is more likely to harm another race. But as Bruce Hoffman, who's a Georgetown University professor and consultant to the government on terrorism, stated, there really is no longer any one profile of a terrorist. We want to believe that there is, but there isn't. It would certainly make our lives a lot easier to just agree that one group is bad and one group is good, and we could live like that. But that's not what reality is. Now, the problem that is that relying heavily on profiling wastes a lot of resources on repeated screening of the same innocent individuals from the group with a high probability of committing the crime. But at the same time, it offers too much protection for the people who might actually commit the crime, but don't fit the profile. It offers too much protection for that white college student who boarded a Southwest flight with knives 7 times. It offers too much protection to the couple who thought they could board a plane with a baby, thought they would get away with it because they were basing it on our presupposed prejudices. Now, as a whole, we all help national security function. To do this, we need to promote equality, because it's not them and us. As a nation, we're a group of others. As Galen said, Irish, Scottish, Puerto Rican. We're not others. We're both Americans. We're both Wellesley students. We're both who we are. We need to confront racial profiling. We need to talk about this. We can't just sweep it under the rug and say it's other causes, it's other forms of discrimination. We will not remain silent. Galen?
Thank you for that. So I guess I'd like to just talk about the constitutionality of this a little bit before we turn this over. And I guess I want to put the burden on you, on all of you, to sort of decide what you guys think about your Constitution and what you think about your country. Because I think that this is really sort of what the round comes down to. Because efficiency, they will throw statistics around, and we are throwing statistics around. And yes, we believe ours are more valid, and they believe theirs are more valid. But I really think this constitutional point is very important, because they really haven't addressed this at all. And this is what our country is founded on. And where fear may skew to statistics on both sides, we have to look at why we value the Constitution, why we have kept it around for so long, why we can't pass it except in this process called strict scrutiny. And even then, when we pass it, years down the road, we try to construct these historical meta-narratives to cover up the internment of Japanese Americans. Why do we do that? Why do we try to forget our own history? What I want to say is that I am sick of forgetting history, and I am sick of us discriminating and then pretending it doesn't happen. We have to realize that these profiling policies are active in almost every single level of our government, And that's wrong. Where our opponents may say that there are like systemic problems that cause one group to like do other acts, to like, do drugs, to be terrorists, to like manufacture Senate cards, more than like other groups, what I want to say is that profiling is one of the policies that contributes to that. Just us already pushing this on an unequal playing field is something terrible, and it's something that our country should not be proud of and should not engage in. So I guess when you're making your decision today, I want you to all look to your Constitution. Look to what it means to be an American and to judge the people next to you. And I don't want you to judge. I want you to look at them through the lens of Jacques Derrida. And I want you to say that they are the radical other. And they're a radical other that you should respect and you should stay back from and you should listen. Because I think that's most important in this debate. Thank you.
It seems to me that we have two different definitions of profiling. The opposition prefers to confuse the definition of profiling with racial discrimination, even though Jillian and I have emphasized that race is merely one aspect of profiling, but not the only aspect. Statistically, men commit more crimes than women, younger people commit more crimes than older people. Low-income areas have more problems with crime and violence than those areas containing people of higher socioeconomic statuses. Most of us accept these facts as facts. Law enforcement officials take this information into account while on the job, and it is generally perceived as being perfectly acceptable to begin a search for a violent criminal by scanning for suspicious males in the area of a crime. So why is it less acceptable to begin a search by looking for suspicious black males? It is fairly common and reasonable for a shopkeeper to pay more attention to any jumpy teenager in her shop that's browsing through clothes that he or she may not be able to afford. So why are we automatically disgusted with the thought of the same shopkeeper following around a black teenager that enters her shop? The element of race somehow always automatically implies an element of racism, even though that may not always be the case. Profiling does not implicitly or explicitly perpetuate racism. As I said before, race is only one of many characteristics that are used every day to identify who is most likely to act in a certain way. Let's take a final look at the most widely discussed, most visible, most spatially contained form of profiling: airport security. Everyone standing in the security line can see when someone has been separated from the larger security line for additional searches. These randomly selected participants generally experience a more thorough search of their bodies and their belongings. After an additional 3 to 5 minutes of routine procedure, the selected passenger will be on his or her way and will board the flight without any further problems. Some might then ask why people are selected as higher risk passengers than others. Some might view this additional procedure as unfair to Muslim passengers. Some might say it is unfair to carefully search only specific types of people rather than everyone. If, however, we were to individually search every passenger that entered an airport, as the opposition suggests, we would be allocating a tremendous amount of resources that could actually be better used to deal with the real issues of eradicating underlying racism and to better train law enforcement officials to administrate profiling policies. It is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the fact that 26 out of 28 of those on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list are Islamic extremists. It is becoming nearly impossible not to be aware of the Department of Homeland Security's warning that al-Qaeda currently poses the biggest security threat to the United States. Profiling is by no means the magic solution that we've been searching for, but it is one way to acknowledge the very real threat that certain groups pose over others. Jillian and I have both made a point, as I said, to explain that profiling is not about race. But as a society, our heightened sensitivities to issues around race has damaged our ability to look at it objectively and our ability to perhaps see it as a beneficial practice to all. The title of this debate makes no mention of race, ethnicity, or religion, but I'm sure that many people, myself included, upon reading the title of this discussion, subconsciously added racial to the phrase profiling practices. Profiling cannot and should not be blamed for the historical and systematic effects of racism in our society, but race can also not be disregarded as a possible indicator of behavior, just as we do not disregard age, gender, education level, and socioeconomic status as legitimate and relevant factors. As an African American Muslim woman, I have been profiled many times throughout my life, but profiling to me is not an infringement upon my civil liberties. It is instead an opportunity for me to assert myself as a non-threat and engage in ongoing conversations about what extremism truly is and how to distinguish the vast majority of Muslims from this small radical sect. And it is these conversations that continue to evolve the profile of a terrorist and continue to strengthen our national security. To say that we shouldn't profile anybody because you can't catch everybody is both illogical and unreasonable. After screening hundreds of likely individuals, stopping just one terrorist could mean saving thousands of lives, and this fact cannot be discounted. If we were to attack the profiling policies used by national security forces, then we must also attack profiling policies used by law enforcement officials every day to keep us safe. We would then have to question every form of profiling that gives special attention to one group over others. In the face of tremendous threat, such an attack on profiling policies is not a productive or rational way to deal with our very immediate concerns and the concerns of any nation. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the formal debate. I would now like to open the floor to questions, but before I do, I want to go over a few guidelines. The first thing that I ask is that the questions be limited only to the specific motion being debated today, and that is profiling practices strengthen national security. Should you wish to address other issues related to the debate but not to the motion, we as a community may do so at a later time. Secondly, since we only have 25 minutes, I will ask that if you are selected to ask a question, you state your name and then limit your question to 4 or 5 sentences, and somewhere within those 4 or 5 sentences is actually a question and not just a speech. I will not hesitate to cut off such a speech, and I will use discretion in terms of time allotted to ask the question and in answering it. Finally, I will not allow any follow-up questions because I would like to cover a range of topics. And I guess I can use my microphone. Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Ashley, class of 2011. And I actually wanted to ask, maybe it was subliminal, but I actually thought the poster did say racial profiling.
No,
It really doesn't?
it doesn't.
No. There you go.
Mecca may have been the only person that I heard explicitly kind of address more internal domestic issues. I think a lot of what we think of when we think of profiling is sort of the airport security example, and I was wondering that if especially the opposition, but both sides could talk a little bit about profiling in other aspects of law enforcement, whether that be speeding or shoplifting. I think they were mentioned casually, but I think this question is much larger than just international terrorist threats, and national security is something bigger than just a relationship between the Middle East and the United States. So I was hoping you could expand your arguments a little bit in that direction.
Well, I think you're right. National security is beyond the airports. It is how we treat our citizens, how we treat one another. As I stated before, it was something black drivers were 20% more likely to be pulled over, but were, I think, 8% less or had 8% of a chance of being found with evidence, while white people were found to have it 17% of the time. I think this really shows the sort of percentages of how many African Americans are being pulled over compared to how many white people, and then within those two percentages, the larger number of white people having contraband when they're pulled over compared to black people. I think it is an issue that we need to confront head on. I think Gail and I were trying to really maintain with a broader scope of national security, but I understand that national security does affect citizens as well.
Yeah, to build off that, actually, like Veronica said, like many of these statistics point to the fact that African American drivers are pulled over far more frequently than white drivers and have drugs far less frequently than white drivers. Like a lot of these stereotypes that we have are really quite unfounded. And I did talk about these ideas of driving while black and who we presume to be doing certain things. And I would like to acknowledge yes, in a crime scene, if someone says, oh my gosh, a guy hit me. Yes, you can look for a guy then, because that's not profiling. That's saying, yes, we have evidence that this was a male who attacked you. But what I'm saying is that when you are standing in a store and if there are two hoodlums in front of you and they are of different racial backgrounds, you should look at both of them equally, because both of them have an equal chance of committing this crime, because you don't know anyone's background. And I'm saying that police officers and in domestic security, we should not judge on any of these levels.
So I guess for me, with the with the domestic issues, I think that looking at national statistics to deal with things at a very local, driving while black level is a big error. When I say that you should look at the percentage of crimes and the statistics, I'm talking about an area. If there's a certain area where it's majority white, and no, let's say there's an all-white area, because we all know that those exist, and you see people driving while black, and all the crimes that have happened in the last month have been committed by someone who is black. That's not something I'm proud of. That's not something that I'm saying is telling to black people, but it does say that there is something suspicious about someone who doesn't belong there at that place at that time.
I'm sorry, that wouldn't be... Sorry, can I interrupt, or would that be rude? That's rude. You should just stop.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can interrupt. I lost my train of thought. No.
Caitlin.
Oh, well, so I guess my point is that, like, if they said, like, yes, a black person committed the crime, that would not be racial profiling then if you pulled over a black person. That, like, goes to my example. Like, if the person who committed the crime was a man, it would not be profiling if you pulled over a man, because that does have...
So how do you define
it's relevant
profiling
to the locality.
exactly?
Also, I just want to add something quick. I'm sorry. I just want to say that, like, some of these statistics are like self-fulfilling prophecies. Because you believe that someone will do something, they may do it just because you believe that. And I think that stigmatization is, like, really dangerous, and we should look to that.
Calling upon race in a crime isn't profiling if it's relevant to the locality and time frame. If someone says, yes, a black man just robbed my house, well, that's not profiling, because it's not their arbitrary assumption that if they physically saw them, that's not racial profiling. I mean, let's be honest.
You're defining profiling as an arbitrary, oh, all black people commit crimes. No, you create a profile whenever a crime is committed. This is the person that we are looking for. That is called a profile. This definition of profiling is being some sort of arbitrary, looking for some random criminal thug hoodlum. That's not actually the definition of profiling, and I'm not sure where you got that from in the first place.
Amnesty International.
Yeah.
This is a question mostly for the pro side, but anybody can jump in. I'd be willing to concede that in the perfect world, profiling could be advantageous. That is, in the perfect world without race, sexism, and any other isms. But in the society ripe with these isms, doesn't profiling just serve as a vehicle for perpetuating them? And I'll take the LL example, for instance. I'm not sure. It seems like we were talking about some different things, but there is racial profiling. And religious profiling that goes on in LL. When I was passing through Tel Aviv this summer, like, it was very easy for me to get through, but my mom, whose name is Marianne O'Malley, she's not Arab, she's not Jewish, was passing through, she was stopped for a long time. So there is racial profiling, but yeah, so maybe it has been successful, maybe it has reduced some financial risk, but doesn't it cost in society? Doesn't it cost, like, in terms of perpetuating divisiveness between Arabs and Jews? Doesn't that outweigh them?
I think that in that sense, yes, but that's what I meant when I said that profiling isn't always used appropriately or correctly. Like, it is supposed to be, if people traveling through the Middle East are more likely to commit crimes in Israel, it's not saying that, oh, you American women are an enemy. It's saying that you fit the profile of someone who, like, may be of higher risk. And I think that as far as, what did you say about us, like, not existing in a perfect society, a perfect world?
What I'm saying is that racial profiling in the perfect world might work, but in a world which suffers from a lot of these problems, racial profiling is like hijacking.
I guess
So how can you argue?
what's so complex about this issue is that it's all or nothing. And I was in Nepal over winter session, and in that airport, they screen everyone. They pat down every single person that comes into the airport. They check every single person's bag by hand, take everything out. You have a gift, they unwrap it. And you don't want to know how long I was in that airport. You don't want to know. There were so many people working. There were so many resources put into exhaustively searching everyone that I don't think, it was a safe airport, like, that was great, but those resources, my point is that they could be allocated to something else. So are you saying that racial profiling or profiling in general, not even related to race, related to anything that we've discussed today, if you're saying that it should be eliminated, even though my point is that it is legitimate in certain aspects, You see, so it's sort of a lose-lose situation. You can exhaust your resources to pat down every single person, and I don't think that's very efficient, or you can, just, as you say, perpetuate like certain ideas.
I think the point that she was trying to make actually, like, so if you're in Ben Gurion Airport, if you're Arab, you're a lot more likely to be pulled not out just for, like, pat down, but to be perhaps aggressively retained for question, and that might further the discrimination that happens between Arabs. And I think that's what she was saying, less about profiling, but that if we are pulling over every Muslim in the airport, maybe that is perpetuating the fear of Muslims in American society. And is that a cost that we are willing to have?
I can do it. We definitely see what you're saying. I think our point was that, yes, we recognize that in our imperfect world that profiling policies can be misconstrued. However, in looking at kind of a cost-benefit equation, that using profiling or using, say, racial profiling or religious profiling, as you were talking about, using that as just a small component of the overall criminal profile, let's say, in a law enforcement situation, then in fact the possibility of generating more resentment is a smaller piece in the greater scheme of things. And actually there was a very interesting paper that I found that did actually calculate using they came up with a formula based on some analysis. Sorry. Okay. They came up with a formula, and indeed that the profiling was a very small piece. I'm sorry, the racial profiling was just a small component because they were looking to address the idea of resentment. So, anyway.
I really want to know, does this answer? Yes. Does the answer to this lie in somewhere within the middle? Because the definition that the pro side gave is very good in theory, but we live in a world, and particularly in this country, that profiling will be materialized through racism and other isms that we have, and it has the potential to allow potential offenders to slip through the cracks. So I want to know for each side, what other, methods to keep us safe have you all researched other than profiling? Because I feel like profiling can be problematic in general. We've seen this in research and through the news.
Well, I mentioned some alternatives in my opening, and I probably should have interspersed them throughout the rest. But first, we can cross-reference. They have these tide sheets where they have the high-risk flyers where there have been reports that these people, like the Nigerian Christmas bomber, how there was a report of him by his own father, and then the government had compiled it, but they didn't cross it with his visas. Now, if we just cross-reference these tide sheets with recent visas, as well as flight patterns, we can definitely narrow the pool, narrow the high-risk flyers based on something besides their ethnicity. Next, if we enhance X-ray techniques, they're full-body scanners. Now, these aren't perfect machines yet, but they're increasing these capabilities to where you can just walk through and it's a full-body scan, like your face and everything else is scrambled, but you can see any metal substances and everything. If we increase these X-rays and make them more efficient and place them in more airports, this can definitely speed up the travel process while not excluding anyone based on their ethnicity. And people like that Southwest flyer with knives 7 times on the plane, he would easily be caught by one of these scanners.
Okay. Do you mind if I jump in? Yeah, I'll go. Okay. Actually, we agree with the cross-checking because that we weren't talking about using only race. That cross-checking computer program that you're talking about, that actually the Obama administration on Friday announced they'd be stepping up various airport security features like that. That looks for name registries, just like the police use in criminal databases. Looks for home country. Looks for travel where someone has been recently, and if there are any abnormalities in the duration or location or frequency with which someone's traveling. So I would actually agree that that sort of cross-checking is indeed useful, but that, again, that is fitting into a kind of profile. So anyway, okay.
Sorry, can I respond to that, or? Oh yeah, sorry, that's not profiling. If like an individual has like a previous felony conviction and that's why he would be on that list, that does not fit under profiling. That's like an individual's past, and that is probable cause. Okay, and I'm not going to read the Amnesty International definition again, but that's what we were talking about. So that wouldn't be considered profiling.
My name is Caitlin Alcala. Hi. One of my good friends is Nigerian, and he was born in Nigeria, educated in England, and then went to school in the United States after that. And he was flying to Kuwait to visit his parents. And when he came back, it was 2 days after the Christmas Day bomber, or the attempt, where the guy was also Nigerian. He was also educated in England, and then he was also educated in the U.S. So this guy, my friend, fit the exact profile of this other guy, and he was stopped and he was put in to interrogation, or I guess he was taken aside and brought into a room and asked more questions because of that. I was wondering if you think that with your definition of profiling that was inappropriate, or because he fit those demographic characteristics that was appropriate.
Yeah, we think that's inappropriate. We're against profiling. And that would fit the definition of profiling. He hasn't had any previous felony convictions. He's only lived in certain areas. His skin is a certain color. I mean, that's straight up profiling with like absolutely no legitimate justification behind this. Now, like according to our plan, like what we talked about, and when we do that insurance analogy, we want to spread the burden. Okay, we want to go back to that Nepal airport. We don't care if it takes you 8 hours to get through security, as long as you're safe and as long as your constitutional rights are not violated. You can wake up really early in the morning. It's going to be okay. So that's what we believe. We believe that we should all share the burden of security, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous that he was pulled out just because he had lived in those certain locations.
Hi, my name is Markin. This is for you guys, and I don't really know a lot about current affairs or statistics. I mostly live in the science center, but my general comprehension of the world, or America, I want to look at domestic security. Is that, the number one killer of Americans is heart disease, cars, and other Americans. So we seem to be getting really bogged down in what is reality and what is not reality. Okay, if people are all racist and this is just a vehicle for their racism, okay, just if we were to throw that out. As a policy, the idea of creating profiles as they have defined it and as in a perfect world it would be applied. Do you think this is a faulty practice, or do you think this has some merit?
I think it's a faulty practice because you can't throw out the real world. I know you want to do that in your question, but we can't do that. We live in a racist society. We live in a society that's sexist. I really don't believe that we can throw out the real world in this equation. And I really like that question before that you had asked, because I think that's really essential. We can't throw out the real world. And I think that any policy that attempts to throw out the real world is just sort of like a white middle-class academic policy that really won't apply in many situations.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Allie. This is directed toward the against the motion side. It seems that you are defining what the for the motion side is as probable cause. And saying that if someone has a prior conviction, that would make them more likely to commit another crime, or if someone was, from an area that showed that they had a high propensity to commit a crime, you're sort of defining that as probable cause, and I haven't really heard what your definition of profiling is and where one stops and the other begins. And it seems that the for the motion side has given sort of a comprehensive definition of what they believe profiling is, and I just wanted, maybe you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, would you mind if I read this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So we've been using the Amnesty International definition of profiling, and we've read this a few times throughout the round, but I understand we've been talking a lot, so it's okay if you tuned out. So it's defined as the targeting of individuals and groups by law enforcement officials, even partially on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion, except where there is trustworthy information relevant to the locality and time frame that links persons belonging to one of the aforementioned groups to an identified criminal incident or scheme. Okay, so what we're saying in this definition is that if you have no cause to link the person to this, but you are linking them, like in that airport example, like there's no reason why this guy should have been implicated in any of this, but he was based on solely on the color of his skin and on his birthplace. And we say that's wrong because that is profiling. However, it is not profiling to say, okay, a man committed a crime, let's go look for men. Because obviously that's like, that's trustworthy information relevant to the locality and the time frame. So there's a distinction between the two. Does that make sense and answer your question?
Partially, I guess in the Nigerian IPT, going back to it, but you're saying if someone said, a man committed a crime for a man, in the Nigerian airport example, it seems that someone who was Nigerian, educated England, committed a crime, it is likely not 100% like definite that they are going to commit a crime, and I just wonder sort of where, again, sort of where your distinction lies.
I think there's a distinction between catching the actual person, because unless I'm mistaken, they caught the Christmas bomber, right? And he was detained, but they were just they sort of equated the Christmas bomber with this random guy. What?
I said after he made it almost all the way to Detroit.
Yeah, I know, but like I'm talking about like after this, like after the Christmas bomber, they had the Christmas bomber. Now, like, why should they relate this Christmas bomber to this random guy that just has the racial characteristics of them? Like, you have to draw a distinction between these two categories.
I think part of that might be, if you look, and I hate to keep using this example, but 9/11, there were multiple terrorists who did the exact same thing, and the flight there weren't 4 flights at the exact same time, so there was a time lag. So I think, especially in the aftermath, they were concerned that what had happened previously, so looking to history, might reoccur.
Hi, I'm Colleen, class of 2012, and I have a question for the pro side. I was wondering if you could clarify your definition of what characteristics profiling is based on. At the beginning, you were talking a lot about psychological and behavioral characteristics, and then you argued that profiling can be very separate from expressions of racism, but then all your examples were profiling based on racism. So what do you think is more important to national security, profiling on behavior and psychological traits versus racial?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my point was that they can't be separated. Like, it's not a hierarchy. It's not, gender. It's not class. It's not age. It's not race. They all are sort of a component of a criminal profile that interact with one another. Does that sort of touch?
Well, and also, I think that the behavioral characteristics are actually quite key, especially when we are drawing similarities between, say, airport screening, national security, and general law enforcement practices or interrogation. That is when behavioral characteristics, someone's looking shifty, someone is acting suspicious. There are actually, there are entire criminal psychology classes that, courses and books and everything about particular traits when someone is doing nervous, suspicious, that all the research that we did when we were looking at what kinds of things would profilers be looking for, a lot of it was really based on behavior. So it's important.
Do you realistically, though, think that the United States has the resources and the motivations that will encourage them to give the people who are the TSA officials, basically, the training that you're speaking of, the really specific psychological training that's required to be putting the let's say, positive profiling into practice in really rapid situations in the airport?
That's an excellent question, and I'm a very practical person, so I like, we got to talk about the practicality. One thing I will say is that there are plenty of people in the country who are trained to do this. If you look at police officers, most of them have training, and there are a lot of police officers. I would say police officers outnumber TSA greatly, so it's possible to have that sort of training. I mean, I don't know a ton about specifics, but also one other example, to go back to the airport in Israel, a lot of the airport officials who actually are engaging in this sort of behavioral analysis, they're actually former military. So there are definitely people out there who are certainly able to be trained and who can be trained. So I think that's a really good question, and not something that I would even pretend to be able to answer. But anyway, those are just a few of our points. Do you have anything you want to add, Becca? No?
Hi, I'm Senta, and I'm actually very interested in this example that you guys gave of the Israeli airport, and I think that a lot of people would argue that, first of all, it's possible for Israel to do that because it's such a small country, and second of all, that a lot of their success has been because they've been using such thorough searches of every single person who goes through. So I was wondering if you guys could maybe just give a couple examples of where profiling can be separated from some of these other things that's been used, and where it actually has been successful in and of itself in preventing some sort of conflict.
So I actually think the most telling example for using the LL Airlines is this case of Anne Marie Murphy, and that was in 1986. And this woman, she was pregnant, and but her fiance was Jordanian, I believe. What happened? They were traveling out of. I don't remember if it was in or out of Israel, but her fiance actually used her to carry some sort of bomb that he intended to get her on the airplane, thinking that she wouldn't be pulled aside because she doesn't fit the profile. Well, the agents at the Israeli airport, something didn't sit right with them. I can't recall exactly, or if they have even said what precisely alerted them, but something was not right. They pulled her aside. She had no idea that her fiance had done this, and they were able to prevent that bomb from getting on the airplane.
Can I just jump in really quickly? I think
Yeah.
that's an example how not profiling helps, because if they had profiled that this pregnant woman wouldn't be one to carry a bomb onto a plane, then she would have gotten onto the plane unknowingly or whatever may be, and
That's an
destroyed the
example.
plane. So I don't
That's
see
an-
if they had, because they didn't profile her, they went with a gut feeling. It wasn't because her race or because she was pregnant. So I don't understand.
That was an example of how racial profiling doesn't work, but how behavioral profiling can be very successful.
Hi, my name is Casey. This is for the 4 group. The definition of profiling that you've offered is ideal, but I think we can all agree that in our country it does come down on race pretty frequently. Do you guys stand behind the government's use of racial profiling in that particular instance?
Do we stand behind the government's use of racial profiling and the way it currently does use it? Oh. I think, like I said, we don't live in a perfect country. We don't live in a perfect society. And I definitely think there's room for improvement. And I think that our argument really outlines, ways that it could be improved, ways that training could be improved. And I don't think the current way is the most efficient, but there are a lot of things that could be changed. So I'm not 100% satisfied with the way that profiling currently works in the society, but I do think that in the future it could possibly be more successful.
And I would just say, I guess maybe as a plug for these debates, that's exactly why we want to bring these issues to light so that we can talk about them and hopefully improve what's going on now.